Welcome to Backlight, where we will be taking you behind the scenes of our investigations at Lighthouse Reports. We are an independent, investigative newsroom working with the world's leading media on stories that serve the public interest. Every month, we will be interviewing a lead contributor behind one of our recent investigations for practical insights into how these are conducted. My name is Beatriz Ramalho de Silva, and I'm a reporter at Lighthouse. Today, I'm speaking to my colleague Crofton Black, a senior reporter at Lighthouse Reports who led our most recent investigation from the surveillance newsroom, Ghost in the Network. This investigation reveals a surveillance apparatus used by governments and companies around the world, built by one man, Andreas Fink, a tech expert, telecom entrepreneur, and former ally of Julian Assange. Fink's setup is capable of exploiting loopholes in mobile phone connection protocols to track the location of phone users. It was also used to redirect SMS messages and crack people's internet accounts. And his activities span the world. The investigation found traces of his surveillance system in Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Europe. Among its users were a prominent Israeli intelligence firm, but it was also offered directly to government agencies in some countries. Hi, Crofton. Welcome.
Hi, Beatrice.
This investigation has been in the works for over a year. Can you talk us through how it began?
Sure. Well, I talked to a lot of people in the telecom industry, and as I was talking to people over the last sort of period of time, there was one name that kept popping up like more and more regularly. That was Andreas Fink Telecom Services. It just seemed like, every few months there was a little bit more that I was being told about him. And then eventually, we got hold of some additional data about his operations. And it was kind of at that point that I decided that, we really needed to dig into his activities a bit more deeply. We did that. And then like a bit later down the line, we went to some partners, especially our colleagues at Der Spiegel and Haaretz. And we pitched to them the idea that this was a potentially useful investigation that we could do.
You've been working on the topic of surveillance for years, and a lot of your work involves dealing with confidential sources. For this particular investigation, you had to work through a large dataset of network access points to understand how Andreas Fink's surveillance apparatus worked. Can you explain a bit more about this and the methodology behind the story?
Yeah, so we're talking here about phone network surveillance, which means basically interrogating the network that your mobile phone is attached to see if that can be somehow tricked into releasing some data about you, where you're at, what you're doing, that kind of thing. And in order to communicate with a mobile phone network in that manner, you need to have an access point, which in the business, they call it a global title, a GT. A global title is really just like, it looks like a phone number, and it's kind of a node in the telecom network that sends what they call signaling messages. So a signaling message is a message in a certain communications protocol that basically asks for data that can help carry out calls or carry out SMS sending or activities like that. So, you can't, all the functions that exist when you want to make a phone call to somebody or send a message to somebody, there has to be some kind of prior communication between the network you're on and the network they're on in order to set up the ability for you to communicate. And that's what the signaling message does. And it's also the case that those messages can be kind of leveraged to provide, let's say, unintended functions that they weren't meant to do, such as providing your location to a surveillance entity, and in some cases being able to intercept SMS messages, which can offer access to internet accounts and stuff like that. So in order to map this kind of activity within a network, a kind of crucial thing is that you have to know the identity of the global titles, the GTs that are being used to send these types of hostile messages. And so a large part of our investigation was kind of trying to build up a picture and understanding of which GTs were being used for particular types of activities and ultimately who was using them. We were essentially trying to identify the GTs that Fink telecom services were using. And so in order to do this, we had to kind of make a list of GTs that we came across in our research and figure out which of them were listed in publicly accessible data as having a particular entity using them, owning them, being registered as having access to them, or whether we had to find other mechanisms, non-public ones, for finding out who was using those access points. So, I mean, in a nutshell, that was really the data set we were working with and building up, was a list of specific GTs that were leased from phone networks in different countries. In some cases, it's quite untransparent. So the fact that you see a GT from, say, somewhere in like Vanuatu or Fiji or Madagascar sending a signaling message at a target doesn't necessarily mean that the person who is ultimately behind that is in any of those places. They could just have leased access from some other point. And that was what our research was kind of trying to do, was to establish ways that we could firmly show who was using the GTs and ultimately isolate the ones that Fink telecom services were using and use that to build up a pattern of activity that was attributable to that particular entity.
To find out more about our investigative journalism and how to get involved, do subscribe to our newsletter. You can do this on our website, lighthousereports.com. What did you find out about how this surveillance system was being used?
What we found was a pretty broad array of activities. So in terms of the data that we had access to, we could see efforts to locate targets or to extract confidential subscriber data, such as the IMSI number, in quite a wide variety of countries. We could also see instances where this set of global titles that were used by Fink telecom services were being used to carry out SMS redirects in some parts of the world. If you carry out an SMS redirect, that means obviously that if somebody is sent a verification code to get access to one of their internet accounts, then if it's redirected to an attacker, then essentially it gives that person access to the account instead. So we were able to build up some profiles of these types of activities in the data we saw. We were also able to see signs of firewall testing, like quite widespread on a global scale efforts to essentially test and see if there were ways around protective firewalls that are put in place by certain networks. And then outside of that, there were particular incidents that came to light in terms of the reporting. So, for example, there was one incident in which Andreas Fink was in Democratic Republic of the Congo. He gave a demonstration to the intelligence agency there of how he could use his surveillance platform to locate people in the Congo. He managed to locate an anonymous person who was using a particular Facebook account that the government said was being used to disseminate fake news about the government, for example. In another instance, he contacted somebody working in a telecom outfit in a different country in Africa, basically offering $1,000 a month for access to their phone network. And when he was doing that, he said he was doing it to track, quote, suspects in countries including Mali. Ultimately, we identified a relatively wide variety of different types of activity that his infrastructure was carrying out. Of course, that's not necessarily to say who the clients were for each particular activity. So we knew that he worked with a variety of clients. One of them was a quite well-known Israeli intelligence firm, that's Rayzone Group. But that's certainly not the only client who he was connected to.
Following publication, the mobile phone trade body, GSMA, recommended cutting off Fink's network access, and now the Swiss regulator is looking into his activities from a legal perspective. Crofton, what do you think are the wider implications of this investigation?
Well, on the one hand, I think one implication or one understanding we can derive from this investigation is that, like, we're looking at this now 10 years after the Snowden leaks. I think people will, in some cases, find it surprising that, this type of surveillance network penetration is available on quite a wide scale, not only to, let's say, huge national infrastructure hubs like the NSA and GCHQ and whatever, but that in a sense, like, there are private actors, sometimes individuals even, who are able to sell surveillance services and penetrate networks to the extent that I think we've shown that Fink was able to do. On the other hand, like, we do see some attempts made in the industry to get to grips with the problems that have been outlined in this investigation. So there are steps that can be taken, for example, to make it harder for certain threat actors or like surveillance related entities or whatever to gain access to the global titles that are necessary to carry out this type of network surveillance. And, we see there's noises being made in the industry that they're going to try and beef up their protections against people like Fink having this type of access. So it could be in the next year or so that we can see that some things change in that regard. It's certainly technically possible to cut off these types of bad actors out of networks. But, for many phone operators, not for all, but for some phone operators, there is obviously an economic incentive to allowing more people to pay for their services that they offer. And there's an economic disincentive to, preventing too much traffic from going into their networks. So ultimately, there is an economic argument either way, and we have to see like which way it's likely to pan out.
Thank you, Crofton.
Thanks a lot, Beatrice.
This story was published with Der Spiegel, Haaretz, Tages&Zeiger, and Mediapart. Thank you for listening. Visit lighthousereports.com to read more about our investigation. You can follow us on Twitter @LHReports.